The mud clung to Elias's boots like the very past he was trying to outwalk. Each step was a heavy, deliberate negotiation with the earth, a silent plea for the ground to hold steady under the weight of a man who had lost everything. He had walked for what felt like lifetimes, crossing borders drawn by men who had never seen the devastating artillery fire that had erased his farm, his village, and his previous life from the map. The coat he wore was patched, smelling of wood smoke, old rain, and exhaustion. Beneath it, his heart beat in a slow, hollow rhythm, a metronome keeping time in an empty room. He was 42 years old, but his reflection in the muddy puddles along the mountain road showed a man who had aged a decade in a single, terrifying year. His wife's face, a memory that used to bring him warmth, now brought a sharp, physical ache to his chest. She had not survived the winter evacuation. Elias had buried her under a frozen oak tree, marking the grave with a pile of stones that he knew would eventually be swallowed by the moss and the forest. Since that day, he had not truly lived. He had merely persisted. The piece of paper in his breast pocket felt heavier than the iron tools in his rucksack. It was a deed. He had traded the last of his family's hidden gold, a small, intricate necklace that had belonged to his grandmother, to a cynical property clerk in the border town 3 days ago. The clerk had looked at the gold, then at Elias, and pushed the deed across the table with a look that was equal parts pity and mockery. It was for a property nestled in an isolated, forgotten valley on the safe side of the border. The clerk had warned him it was uninhabitable, an abandoned husk left to rot after the mining industry in the region dried up 50 years prior. Elias had not cared. He did not want a home. He wanted a fortress of solitude, a place where the world could not reach him, where the sound of artillery would not echo in the valleys, and where he could quietly dismantle his own existence in peace. When Elias finally crested the ridge and saw the house, he realized the clerk had been generous in his description. It was not merely uninhabitable, it was a corpse of a building. It sat in a slight depression near the edge of a dense, dark pine forest, surrounded by overgrown thistles and dying grass. The roof sagged violently in the center, as if the spine of the house had been snapped by a giant hand. Most of the slate shingles were gone, scattered in the tall weeds like discarded scales. Before I continue, I'd like to make a quick announcement. I'm sharing some really steamy and completely uncensored orc stories on my Patreon page, stories I can't post on YouTube. You can find the details in the description. Just a heads up, the content there is really teeth of broken glass clinging to the frames, staring blindly out at the bleak landscape. The front porch was entirely collapsed on one side, the wooden beams returning to the earth in a slow, decaying melt. A stone chimney stood at the side, remarkably intact, but choked with thick, dead ivy. It was a ruin. It was perfect. Elias walked down the slope, his legs trembling from the final descent. The wind howled through the broken structure, creating a low, mournful whistle that sounded like breath passing through dry bones. He approached the front door, which was hanging on a single rusted hinge, and pushed it open. It scraped against the warped floorboards with a sound like a shriek. The interior smelled of damp earth, animal droppings, and decades of absolute abandonment. Leaves were piled in the corners of the front room, blown in by countless autumn storms. Above him, he could see the gray sky through the gaping holes in the roof. The plaster on the walls had crumbled away, revealing the wooden lath beneath. It was colder inside the house than it was outside, the stone foundation seeming to hold the winter chill deep within its core. He dropped his rucksack onto the floor. The heavy thud kicked up a cloud of ancient dust that danced in the pale shafts of light piercing the gloom. Elias stood in the center of the room, looking around. There was a rusted cast-iron stove in the kitchen area, its pipe disconnected and lying on the floor. A heavy wooden table, surprisingly robust, sat in the center of the kitchen, though one of its legs was heavily chewed by rodents. To the left, a doorway led to a smaller room, perhaps a parlor or a bedroom, equally desolate. This was his kingdom of nothingness. He took a deep breath, letting the cold, stale air fill his lungs. He would start by clearing a space to sleep. He did not have the energy to care about the future. He only had the energy to survive the next few hours. For the first 2 days, Elias existed in a state of mechanical motion. He was driven purely by the instinct to not freeze to death. He gathered fallen branches from the edge of the pine forest, breaking them over his knee to feed the small fire he had managed to build in the rusted stove. He had reconnected the stovepipe, sealing the cracks with wet mud from the yard. The smoke still leaked slightly, stinging his eyes, but it provided a meager circle of warmth in the vast, freezing house. He spent hours sweeping out the leaves and debris from the main room, using a bundle of pine boughs tied together with twine as a makeshift broom. He patched the largest window in the room with a piece of heavy canvas he had carried with him, nailing it to the rotting frame to stop the relentless wind. He ate hardtack and dried meat, chewing slowly, staring at the embers of his fire, his mind entirely blank. He refused to think about his farm, the wheat fields that would be turning golden right now if they hadn't been burned to ash. He refused to think about her. On the evening of the 3rd day, the temperature plummeted drastically. The sky turned the color of bruised iron, and the air grew sharp and brittle. Elias knew a deep freeze was coming. He needed more wood. He took his small hatchet and walked to the dilapidated barn that sat about 50 yards behind the house. He hadn't explored it yet, assuming it was as empty and broken as the main dwelling. The barn doors were swollen with moisture and stuck fast. He threw his shoulder against the wood, grunting with the effort. With a loud crack, the doors gave way, spilling him forward into the dark, cavernous interior. The barn smelled of old hay and dry rot. It was darker here, the only light coming from the open doorway behind him. As Elias regained his footing and brushed the dirt from his coat, his ears caught a sound. It was incredibly faint. A shift, a rustle, the sound of fabric moving against wood. He froze, his hand tightening instinctively around the handle of his hatchet. Animals were common, but this didn't sound like a raccoon or a stray dog. The movement had a deliberate, cautious quality to it. It came from the back corner of the barn, near the remnants of an old horse stall. "Who is there?" Elias called out. His voice was raspy from disuse, echoing harshly in the empty space. There was no answer, but the silence that followed was thick, tense, and held breath. Someone was there. Elias stepped forward, his boots crunching loudly on the dried straw. He raised the hatchet slightly. He was a peaceful man by nature, a man who grew things, but the war had taught him that the world was full of desperate, violent people. "I said, who is there? I own this land. Show yourself!" He reached the edge of the stall and peered into the shadows. Huddled in the farthest corner, buried beneath a pile of ancient, dusty horse blankets, was a figure. The figure flinched as Elias stepped closer. Slowly, a face emerged from the ragged wool. It was a woman. She looked terrifyingly fragile. Her face was smudged with dirt and soot, her cheekbones sharp and hollow, her lips cracked and pale. She was shivering so violently that the blankets around her trembled like leaves in a storm. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the dim light, were locked onto the hatchet in Elias's hand. They were the eyes of a hunted animal, full of a deep, primal terror. She shrank back against the wooden wall, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. Elias lowered the hatchet slowly. The surge of defensive adrenaline drained out of him, replaced by a sudden, heavy exhaustion. He recognized that look. He had seen it on the faces of his neighbors when the soldiers came. He had seen it in the mirror. "I won't hurt you," he said, his voice softer now, though still rough. She did not speak. She simply watched him, her breathing shallow and rapid. Her clothes were a mismatched collection of rags, utterly insufficient for the creeping cold. She was not a local. Her features, the dark, matted hair, the olive tone of her skin beneath the grime, marked her as someone from further south, from the regions where the border patrols were most aggressive. She was an illegal immigrant, someone who had crossed the mountains looking for safety, just as he had, but without even the meager protection of a stamped paper. "How long have you been hiding here?" Elias asked. She shook her head slightly, just a millimeter of movement, pressing herself harder against the wall. Elias let out a long, weary sigh. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw. He didn't want this. He didn't want the responsibility of another human being. He had come here to be alone with his ghosts. He looked at her again. She was freezing to death. If he left her in this barn tonight, the cold snap would finish her. He knew he could simply turn around, walk back to his small fire, and lock the door. It would be the easy thing to do, the safe thing to do. But as he looked at her trembling hands clutching the filthy blanket, a memory pierced through his carefully constructed numbness. His wife, Elena, tending to a stray lamb that had been caught in a winter storm. She had wrapped it in a towel and held it near the hearth, stroking its head until it stopped shivering. "We do what we can, Elias," she had said, looking up at him with those warm eyes. "Life is hard enough without us turning away from the helpless." Elias cursed silently under his breath. He hooked the hatchet back onto his belt. "You can't stay out here," he said, keeping his voice level. "You'll freeze tonight. The temperature is dropping." She remained silent, but her grip on the blanket tightened. "I have a fire in the house," Elias continued, pointing a thumb back toward the open barn door. "It's not much, but it's warmer than here. You can sit by the stove." She didn't move. She didn't trust him. Why should she? Men in this world usually meant danger, violence, or betrayal. "Look," Elias said, taking a step back to give her space. "I am going back inside. I will leave the front door open. If you want to freeze, stay here. If you want to live, come inside." He turned his back on her, a deliberate gesture of non-aggression, and walked out of the barn. He gathered an armful of the dry wood he had initially come for, his movements slow and steady. He walked back to the house, deliberately keeping his pace measured. When he stepped through the front door, he set the wood down by the stove, stoked the embers, and added 3 thick logs. The fire caught, the flames licking hungrily at the dry bark, casting a warm, flickering orange light across the bleak room. He sat down on a turned-over bucket, picked up his knife, and began whittling a piece of kindling, staring into the flames. He left the front door open. The biting wind immediately began to war with the heat from the stove, making the canvas over the window flap noisily. Elias didn't look toward the door. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The cold was winning the battle in the room. He was just about to stand up and shut the door, concluding that she had chosen the barn, when a shadow fell across the threshold. He didn't look up from his whittling. He heard the soft, hesitant scrape of footsteps on the wooden floor. She moved silently like a ghost, her bare feet clad only in thin, torn socks. She paused just inside the doorway. Elias kept his eyes on the piece of wood in his hands. "Shut the door behind you," he said quietly. "You're letting the heat out." There was a pause, then the squeak of the rusted hinge and the heavy thud of the door closing. The wind was cut off, and the room immediately felt smaller, more contained. Elias heard her shuffle closer. He finally looked up. She was standing about 10 feet away from the stove, hovering in the liminal space between the light of the fire and the deep shadows of the room. She was clutching her arms around her chest, shivering so hard her teeth were audibly chattering. Elias stood up. The woman immediately took a half-step back, her eyes wide. Elias stopped, reached behind him, and dragged the heavy wooden table closer to the stove. He pulled a dusty wooden chair from the corner and set it beside the table, within the radius of the heat. "Sit," he said. He walked to the far side of the room, near the window, and sat back down on his bucket, putting the width of the room between them. He watched her. She hesitated for a long moment, eyeing the chair, then looking at him. Slowly, agonizingly, she crept forward. She reached the chair and perched on the very edge of it, leaning toward the cast-iron stove. The heat hit her face, and for a second her eyes fluttered shut, a look of profound, desperate relief washing over her sharp features. Elias reached into his rucksack. He pulled out a tin cup, a small dented pot, and a canteen of water he had filled from the stream earlier that day. He walked over to the stove. She flinched as he approached, but he ignored her, moving with slow, deliberate actions. He poured the water into the pot and set it on the flat top of the stove. Then he took a small, cloth-wrapped bundle from his sack. It was tea. Real, black tea, a luxury he had held on to. He crumbled a few leaves into the tin cup. When the water began to boil, sending up a thin plume of steam, he poured it into the cup. The rich, earthy aroma filled the space between them. He set the cup on the table, near her hand, and retreated back to his bucket. "Drink," he said. "It will warm your blood." She stared at the cup. Steam curled up from the dark liquid. She looked at Elias, her eyes searching his face for a trick, for a price. He simply met her gaze, his expression flat and unreadable, before returning his attention to his knife and his piece of wood. Slowly her hands crept toward the table, her fingers, red and raw from the cold, wrapped around the hot tin. She winced at the heat, but didn't let go. She brought the cup to her lips and took a small, cautious sip. She swallowed, and Elias watched the warmth travel down her throat. She took a deeper drink, her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch from her ears. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the crackle of the burning wood, the whistling of the wind outside, and the soft, occasional clinking of the tin cup against the wooden table. "Maya," she said suddenly. Elias stopped whittling. He looked up. Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and strained, but the word was distinct. "My name," she added, her eyes on the floor. "It is Maya." Elias looked at her for a long moment. She was still shivering, but less violently now. The tea had brought a faint flush of color to her pale cheeks. "Elias," he replied, his voice gruff. He went back to his whittling. That was the extent of their conversation for the first week. The arrangement was entirely unspoken. Maya stayed. She slept in the small parlor room on a pile of pine needles Elias had gathered and covered with his spare woolen blanket. Elias slept in the main room by the stove. They moved around each other like two solitary animals forced to share a small cage, careful never to cross paths too closely, always aware of the other's location. Elias woke up at dawn every day. He would stoke the fire, put a pot of water on to boil, and then go outside. The ruined house required an impossible amount of labor just to keep it from collapsing completely under the impending weight of winter. He spent hours clearing the debris from the yard, dragging the rotting porch beams away to chop for firewood. He began the arduous task of repairing the roof, climbing a rickety ladder he had found in the barn, nailing scavenged boards and pieces of tin over the gaping holes. It was brutal, freezing work. His hands were constantly bleeding, the skin cracking from the cold and the rough lumber. He welcomed the physical pain. It was a distraction from the heavy, suffocating silence in his chest. When he would return to the house at midday, his hands numb and his breath frosting, he would find that the water was boiled, and his portion of the dried rations was set out on the table. Maya never handed it to him directly. She would retreat to her corner of the parlor, watching him silently as he ate. In the afternoons, while Elias chopped wood in the forest, Maya began to emerge from her shell, just slightly. She started cleaning. It began with the kitchen table. When Elias came back one evening, the thick layer of grime and dust that had coated the wood was gone. The wood had been scrubbed raw with sand and water from the stream, revealing the pale, sturdy oak beneath. The next day, the floorboards in the main room had been swept entirely clean of dirt, the cobwebs in the lower corners brushed away. She worked silently, relentlessly, using whatever she could find, a rag torn from the hem of her ragged dress, a handful of coarse grass, ash from the stove. Elias noticed, but he didn't say anything. He didn't want to encourage her, but he couldn't deny the strange comfort of walking into a room that felt slightly less like a tomb. One evening, about 2 weeks after she had arrived, Elias returned from the forest carrying a prize. He had found a patch of wild winter carrots and a few hardy tubers growing near a sheltered outcrop of rocks. He dumped them onto the scrubbed table. They were small, twisted, and covered in frozen dirt, but to a man who had eaten nothing but hardtack and dried salty meat for a month, they looked like gold. He walked outside to wash his hands at the pump he had managed to prime the day before. When he came back inside, the tubers were gone from the table. He paused, frowning. He looked over to the stove. Maya was standing there. She had already washed the vegetables. She was using a rusted, dull knife she had found in the dirt outside to carefully scrape the skins off the carrots. Her movements were practiced, precise. Elias walked over, standing a few feet away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own hunting knife, the blade sharp and clean. He held it out toward her, handle first. Maya stopped. She looked at the knife, then up at his face. Her eyes held that familiar flicker of apprehension. A knife was a weapon. But she looked at the dull, rusted piece of metal in her own hand, then back at his. Slowly she reached out and took the hunting knife from him. Their fingers did not touch. "Thank you," she whispered. It was the first time she had spoken since she told him her name. Elias gave a brief nod and walked away. He sat in his chair and watched her work. She chopped the vegetables into precise, even cubes. She put them into the pot of boiling water, adding a pinch of salt from the small pouch on the table, and then, surprisingly, she added a handful of dried herbs she must have gathered from the edge of the woods while he was working. An hour later, the smell filling the ruined house was incredible. It wasn't just boiled water and salt. It smelled like an actual meal. It smelled like sustenance. Maya took 2 tin bowls. Elias had found a second one in the barn, and ladled the thin stew into them. She set one on Elias's side of the table and took hers, turning to walk back to her corner. "Sit," Elias said. Maya froze. She looked back over her shoulder. "Sit at the table," Elias repeated, gesturing to the empty space across from him. "It's foolish to eat in the cold corner when the stove is here." Maya hesitated. She gripped her warm bowl tightly. Slowly, she walked back to the table and sat down on the overturned bucket Elias usually used, pulling it as far away from him as she could while still remaining at the table. They ate in silence. The stew was simple, but the wild herbs gave it a savory depth that made Elias's mouth water. It was the best thing he had tasted in a year. He finished his bowl quickly, scraping the bottom with his spoon. He looked up to see Maya watching him, her own bowl only half empty. "It's good," Elias said. The words felt strange in his mouth, clumsy and rusty. "You know how to cook." Maya looked down at her bowl. "My mother taught me," she said softly. "Before." She didn't elaborate on what before meant, and Elias didn't ask. He knew better than anyone that before was a country you could never return to, a place that only existed to cause pain in the present. "We need more wood," Elias said, changing the subject, focusing on the practical, the immediate. "The snow will come soon, heavy snow. We need enough to keep the stove burning day and night, or the frost will come through the walls." "I can help," Maya said. Elias looked at her thin arms, her fragile frame. "It's heavy work." "I am stronger than I look," she replied, lifting her chin just a fraction. It was the first spark of defiance, of life he had seen in her. "I have carried heavy things." Elias studied her for a moment. He saw the grim determination in her dark eyes. She didn't want to be a burden. She wanted to earn her place in this ruin. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow, you help me haul." The next morning, the dynamic shifted. They were no longer just two ghosts haunting the same space. They were a team, bound by the sheer necessity of survival. Elias chopped the wood in the forest, bringing down dead trees with rhythmic, echoing strikes of his axe. Maya followed behind him, gathering the split logs, her arms wrapped around piles of wood that seemed nearly as big as she was. She stumbled often over the uneven, frozen ground, but she never complained. She would carry the wood back to the house, stacking it neatly against the exterior wall near the door, creating a thick, insulating barrier of timber. They worked in tandem for hours. Elias found himself falling into a rhythm with her. He would chop, she would gather. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them began to change. It was no longer the tense, suffocating silence of suspicion. It became the comfortable, shared silence of labor. Elias would occasionally glance over his shoulder to check on her, making sure she hadn't fallen. Once, she dropped a heavy log on her toe and let out a sharp gasp, sinking to one knee. Elias dropped his axe and walked over immediately. He knelt beside her. "Let me see," he said. Maya pulled away instinctively, her eyes widening. "Maya," Elias said, his voice firm but gentle. "Let me see. If you break your foot, you can't work. If you can't work, we don't get wood." She hesitated, then slowly extended her foot. The thin fabric of her sock was torn and blood was welling up from a scrape on her toe, but the bone didn't look broken. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief. He wrapped it tightly around her toe, his large, calloused hands moving with surprising gentleness. "It's not broken," he said, looking up at her face. They were close, closer than they had ever been. He could see the exhaustion etched deep into the lines around her eyes, the faint smattering of freckles across her nose that the dirt had previously hidden. "Thank you," she breathed. "Take smaller loads," Elias instructed, standing up and brushing the snow from his knees. "There is no prize for carrying the most at once." Maya nodded, standing up carefully and testing her weight on the foot. She went back to work, taking smaller loads as instructed, but her pace never slowed. That evening, the first real snow began to fall. It didn't flurry. It dumped. The sky opened up, releasing a thick, blinding curtain of white that rapidly covered the world, erasing the jagged lines of the ruined landscape and replacing them with soft, smooth mounds. Inside the house, the temperature dropped, but the stove, fueled by the massive pile of wood they had gathered, burned bright and hot. Elias was sitting at the table attempting to repair a broken harness he had found in the barn, intending to use the leather for hinges. Maya was sitting by the stove, sewing. Elias had given her a small sewing kit he had carried in his pack, and she was meticulously attempting to patch the gaping holes in her dress with scraps of canvas. The wind howled outside, a high, violent pitch that rattled the canvas over the window. Suddenly, a massive gust hit the house, and a section of the rotting ceiling above the parlor gave way. With a loud crack and a shower of plaster dust and freezing snow, a heavy beam crashed to the floor, missing Maya's sleeping area by only a few feet. Maya screamed, dropping her sewing and scrambling backward away from the debris, her hands over her head. She hit the wall and curled into a tight ball, her breathing ragged, hyperventilating. Elias dropped his leather and rushed over. He looked up at the hole in the ceiling. The snow was pouring in, a steady stream of white powder threatening to bury the room. He looked at Maya. She wasn't just startled. She was having a panic attack. The loud noise, the sudden collapse, it had triggered something deep and terrible within her. He knelt beside her. "Maya, Maya, look at me." She was shaking her head, her eyes squeezed shut, her hands clamped over her ears. She was murmuring something in a language Elias didn't understand, rapid and panicked. "Maya," Elias said, louder this time. He reached out and grasped her shoulders firmly. He didn't shake her, but he held her tightly, trying to ground her. You are safe. It was just the roof. You are in the house. You are safe. She gasped, her eyes flying open. She looked at him, but she wasn't seeing him. She was seeing something else, some past horror. Elias held her gaze, keeping his own expression calm, steady, unmoving. He became an anchor in her storm. Breathe, he commanded gently. In, out, with me. He exaggerated his own breathing, expanding his chest slowly, then exhaling a long, measured breath. He kept his hands warm and steady on her shoulders. Slowly, agonizingly, the wild terror in her eyes began to recede. She focused on his face, on the solid reality of his presence. She began to mimic his breathing, her ragged gasps smoothing out into shaky, shallow breaths. Good, Elias said softly. You're okay. We're okay. Maya blinked, a tear escaping the corner of her eye and cutting a clean path down her dusty cheek. She looked past him at the fallen beam and the snow drifting onto the floorboards. She shuddered, but the panic had broken. I am sorry, she whispered, pulling her knees to her chest, pulling away from his touch. There is nothing to be sorry for, Elias said, standing up. This house is falling apart. It's a miracle it hasn't collapsed on us completely. He walked over to the debris. He couldn't fix the roof from the outside in this storm. He grabbed a large piece of scrap wood and wedged it diagonally against the hole from the inside, propping it up with another broken beam to act as a temporary barrier against the snow. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would hold for the night. He turned back to Maya. She was still sitting on the floor by the wall, looking small and defeated. The parlor area where she slept was now directly exposed to the freezing draft coming from the patched hole. You can't sleep in there tonight, Elias said. It's too cold, you'll freeze. Maya looked at her pile of pine needles and the single blanket, now lightly dusted with snow. She nodded slowly, knowing he was right. Elias walked to his own sleeping area near the stove. He had a thick wool blanket and a heavy canvas tarp he used as a mattress. He dragged the tarp closer to the stove, spreading it out. He took his blanket and folded it in half. Sleep here, he said, gesturing to the spot beside the stove. It's the warmest place in the house. Maya stood up hesitantly. Where will you sleep? I'll sit in the chair, Elias said. I need to keep the fire going anyway. The storm is bad. If the fire dies, we both freeze. Maya looked at the chair, a hard, unforgiving wooden thing, and then at the spot he had made for her. She opened her mouth to argue, to insist she could sit in the chair, but a massive shudder ran through her body as a draft of icy wind swept through the room. She was too exhausted, too cold to fight. She walked over and lay down on the tarp, pulling the heavy wool blanket up to her chin. The heat from the stove radiated against her back, a physical weight of warmth. She watched Elias pull the wooden chair closer to the stove, sit down and pick up his piece of leather and his knife again. He didn't look at her. He just began to work, his movements steady and rhythmic. Elias? Maya said softly, her voice heavy with sleep. He didn't look up. Yes? In my country, before I left, she paused, her voice catching. There were bombs. The sky would fall. The noise. It makes me... She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Elias stopped his work. He looked at the fire, the orange light reflecting in his eyes. He knew that terror. He knew the sound of the world ending violently from above. He knew what it felt like to be completely powerless as the sky rained fire and stone. I know, Elias said, his voice gravelly and low. I know the sound, Maya. You don't have to explain it to me. He looked at her. Her eyes were closing, the warmth of the fire pulling her into sleep. They burned my farm, Elias said into the quiet room. It was the first time he had spoken of it to anyone. The words felt like pulling teeth, painful and bloody, but they needed to come out. They took everything. My home. My wife. Maya's eyes opened slightly. She looked at him, seeing the profound, aching grief carved into the lines of his face. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell him it would be all right, because she knew it wouldn't be. She just reached out from under the blanket, extending her hand across the wooden floorboards until her fingertips brushed against the muddy toe of his boot. It was a tiny gesture, a fragile bridge of empathy built across an ocean of shared trauma. "I am sorry, Elias," she whispered. Elias looked at her hand, so close to his foot. He felt a tightness in his throat that he swallowed down hard. "Go to sleep, Maya. The fire will hold." Over the next few weeks, as winter locked the valley in a tight, icy grip, the ruined house began to change. The change was not rapid or miraculous, but it was relentless, driven by the stubborn will of two people who had decided, perhaps unconsciously, that they were not ready to die yet. The division of labor became more intricate. Elias handled the heavy exterior work. Whenever the snow stopped and the wind died down enough, he was outside, patching the siding with scavenged wood, reinforcing the foundation stones where the mortar had crumbled, and constantly chopping wood. He found an old rusted hand-cranked drill in the barn and spent 3 evenings cleaning the gears with oil, eventually using it to bore holes and properly bolt the front door back onto its frame, sealing out the worst of the drafts. Maya took command of the interior. She became a master of making something out of nothing. She discovered an old rusted metal bucket buried in the dirt of the root cellar. She hauled it up, scrubbed it with sand and snow until her hands bled, and turned it into a wash basin. She found a coil of thick wire and strung it across the warmest part of the main room near the stove, creating a drying line for their damp clothes. One day, while Elias was out setting snares in the pine forest, Maya ventured back into the dilapidated barn. She spent hours digging through the debris, coughing on the ancient dust. She found a heavy, moth-eaten tapestry buried under a collapsed workbench. It was faded, depicting a hunting scene that was barely recognizable beneath decades of grime, but the fabric was thick and heavy. She dragged it back to the house, boiled snow over the stove to wash it, and spent 2 days meticulously darning the largest holes with thread she unspooled from an old sack. When Elias returned from the woods on the 3rd day, carrying 2 scrawny rabbits he had managed to trap, he stopped dead in his tracks as he walked through the door. The tapestry was hung over the large patched window in the main room, acting as a thick, insulating curtain. It blocked the gray light, but it also blocked the biting draft completely. The room immediately felt 10 degrees warmer, the heat from the stove trapped effectively within the space. He looked at Maya, who was standing by the stove, stirring a pot of melting snow. She looked back at him, a tiny, tentative smile playing on her lips. It was the first time he had seen her smile. It changed her entire face, erasing the harsh lines of fear and revealing a youthful warmth beneath. "It holds the heat better," she said simply. Elias walked over and dropped the rabbits on the table. He reached out and touched the thick fabric of the tapestry. It was rough, but it was a barrier against the harsh world outside. "It's good work, Maya," he said, turning to look at her. "Thank you." That evening, they ate roasted rabbit. It was a feast compared to their usual rations. Maya had found some wild garlic bulbs in the cellar and roasted them alongside the meat. As they ate, sitting across from each other at the heavy wooden table, the silence was no longer heavy. It was comfortable. "Where did you learn to sew like that?" Elias asked, nodding toward the tapestry. Maya swallowed a bite of food and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "My grandmother. She was a tailor in our village. She made suits for the men, beautiful dresses for the women. She tried to teach me, but I was clumsy. I always pricked my fingers." She looked down at her hands, which were rough and calloused now, far from the delicate hands of a tailor's apprentice. She used to say, "Maya, a needle is like a sharp tongue. You must know exactly where to put it, or you will cause bleeding." Elias let out a low chuckle. It was a rusty sound, surprised out of him. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Maya said, her smile fading slightly, a shadow crossing her eyes. She did not leave the village when the soldiers came. She said she was too old to walk." Elias stopped chewing. He laid his knife down on the table. He understood the unspoken end to that story. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "My wife, Elena," Elias began, his voice quiet. "She was a baker. She could take flour and water and make something that tasted like a memory of summer. She loved the farm. She loved the dirt on her hands. When they told us to evacuate, she refused to pack anything of value. She only packed seeds. She said, 'Wherever we go, Elias, we must plant a garden. A house is not a home until something grows outside its door.'" Maya watched him, her dark eyes wide and compassionate. She listened as he spoke, letting him pour the memories out into the warm, fire-lit room. They spent the rest of the evening talking. It was halting at first, awkward leaps across the chasm of their different languages and cultures. But they found common ground in the universal language of loss. They spoke of the people they loved, the places they missed, the small, mundane details of their past lives that they now realized were the most precious things they had possessed. They didn't talk about the war. They didn't talk about the violence. They talked about the smell of rain on hot pavement in Maya's city and the sound of the wind through the wheat fields on Elias's farm. They built a shared history out of their separate tragedies. As winter deepened, the house continued to evolve, and so did their routine. They were no longer two strangers surviving. They were a partnership. Elias found a rusted iron bed frame in the ruins of a neighboring, long-abandoned cabin 3 miles away. He dragged it back through the snow, piece by piece, a grueling task that took him 4 days. He reassembled it in the parlor, cleaning the rust and bracing the legs with scrap wood. Maya spent a week gathering dry pine needles and dried grass, stuffing them into a massive sack she had sewn from leftover canvas to create a mattress. It wasn't soft, but it was off the cold floor. She insisted Elias take it, as his back was constantly aching from the heavy labor, but he stubbornly refused, threatening to sleep in the snow if she didn't take the bed. She relented, her eyes shining with unshed tears at the gesture. They began to find a rhythm to their days. The mornings were for labor, hauling wood, melting snow for water, tending to the endless minor repairs the house demanded. The afternoons were for hunting and gathering. Maya proved to have a sharp eye for edible roots and winter berries, expanding their meager diet. The evenings, however, were sacred. When the sun dipped below the mountains, plunging the valley into freezing darkness, they would pull their chairs close to the stove. The single oil lamp they had salvaged cast a warm, golden glow over the scrubbed wooden table. Maya would sew or mend, her fingers flying nimbly over the fabric. Elias would whittle, carving small wooden figures out of soft pine. He started carving animals, a bear, a rabbit, a clumsy-looking horse. He would place them on the edge of the table when he finished, and Maya would arrange them carefully on a small shelf she had fashioned from a broken floorboard and mounted on the wall. They developed a complex system of nonverbal communication. A raised eyebrow from Elias meant he needed a tool passed to him. A soft tap on the table from Maya meant the tea was ready. They learned the rhythms of each other's moods. Elias knew that when Maya was quiet and stared too long into the fire, the memories were pulling at her, and he would purposefully drop a piece of wood or ask her a mundane question to anchor her back in the present. Maya knew that when Elias rubbed his left shoulder, the old injury from the farm was acting up, and she would silently boil extra water to soak a rag for a hot compress. The deepest connection between them, however, was forged in music. One evening in late January, the wind was particularly brutal, shrieking around the corners of the house like a tortured spirit. Maya was tense, her shoulders hiked up near her ears, her eyes darting toward the walls with every heavy gust. Elias watched her for a moment, then stood up and walked to his rucksack. He dug deep into the bottom and pulled out a small, battered wooden box. He brought it back to the table and opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a harmonica. It had belonged to his father. It was scratched and dented, the silver plating worn off in places, revealing the brass beneath. Elias wiped the mouthpiece on his sleeve, put it to his lips, and blew a soft, tentative chord. The sound was sweet and reedy, cutting through the low rumble of the storm outside. Maya looked up, surprised, her hands pausing in her mending. Elias closed his eyes and began to play. He didn't play a fast, lively tune. He played a slow, mournful melody, an old folk song from his region. The notes bent and stretched, carrying a profound sorrow, but also a fierce, stubborn beauty. The music filled the small, warm space around the stove, pushing back the dark and the cold. When he finished, he lowered the harmonica and opened his eyes. Maya was staring at him, her eyes bright and wet. "That was beautiful," she whispered. "My father taught me," Elias said, running a thumb over the cold metal. "He used to play it in the evenings when the harvest was done." Maya smiled, a small, sad curve of her lips. "In my country, we sing. We sing loudly with drums and guitars. We sing to frighten away the dark." "Sing for me," Elias said quietly. Maya hesitated. She looked down at her hands, twisting the fabric of her skirt. "I have not sung in a long time. My voice is broken." "So is this house," Elias replied, gesturing to the patched walls and the soot-stained ceiling. "But it keeps us warm. Sing, Maya." She looked at him, seeing the genuine request in his eyes. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and began to sing. Her voice was thin at first, raspy from disuse and cold, but as she found the melody, it grew stronger. She sang in her native language, a song with a complex, rolling rhythm and a hauntingly beautiful melody. Elias didn't understand a single word, but he understood the emotion perfectly. It was a song of longing, of a heart reaching across a vast distance for a home that was gone. Her voice filled the room, weaving around the heat of the stove, sinking into the wood of the table and the patched walls. Elias closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. For the first time since he had buried his wife, the tight iron band around his chest loosened slightly. He felt a profound sense of peace. He wasn't alone in the dark anymore. When the song ended, the silence that followed was soft and reverent. Elias didn't speak. He simply raised the harmonica to his lips and played a low, approving chord. Maya laughed, a genuine, startling sound that was like music itself. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. From that night on, the music became a ritual. Elias would play a tune and Maya would sing. They traded songs, traded pieces of their cultures, weaving them together in the small, ruined house in the middle of nowhere. February arrived with a brutality that tested everything they had built. A massive blizzard stalled over the valley, burying the house in snowdrifts that reached the bottom of the windows. The temperature dropped to a level where breathing outside felt like inhaling broken glass. They were trapped inside for 6 days. The woodpile dwindled alarmingly fast. The stove had to be kept burning constantly, eating through the logs with a ravenous hunger. By the 4th day, they were down to the last few pieces of chopped wood. Elias knew he had to go out to the barn, where he had stacked emergency reserves, but the wind was blowing at a gale force, creating a complete whiteout. Opening the front door was dangerous. Venturing the 50 yards to the barn was suicidal. On the morning of the 5th day, the fire in the stove was nothing but a bed of glowing embers. The cold inside the house was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that turned their breath to thick clouds of steam. They were wrapped in every blanket they possessed, huddled together on the floor near the stove, sharing body heat. "I have to go," Elias said, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. He began to unwrap himself from the blankets. Maya grabbed his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "No, you will not find the barn. You will freeze in the yard. If I don't go, we freeze in here," Elias argued, pulling away. He grabbed his heavy coat and began to struggle into it. Maya scrambled up, throwing off her blankets. "Then I go with you."
"We tie a rope. We stay together." Elias looked at her, his eyes hard. "No, you stay here. If I don't come back, you burn the chairs. You burn the table. You stay alive." "I am not staying alone," Maya shouted, her voice cutting through the roar of the wind outside. It was the first time she had raised her voice to him. Her eyes were blazing with a fierce, terrified anger. "I am not waiting here to watch you die. We go together or we burn the chairs, now." Elias stared at her. He saw the iron will beneath her fragile exterior. She had survived a war, a brutal journey across mountains, and months of starvation. She was not a weak woman. She was a survivor, just like him. And she was right. If they were going to fight this, they had to fight it together. "All right," Elias said, his voice grim. "Get your coat." They found a long length of sturdy hemp rope in the parlor. Elias tied one end securely around his waist, using a heavy knot. He handed the other end to Maya, who tied it around her own waist, pulling it tight over her ragged coat. "Stay close," Elias instructed, pulling his scarf up over his nose and mouth. "Keep the rope taut, but don't pull me off balance. We go straight out the door and don't deviate. The barn is directly behind the house." Maya nodded, wrapping a strip of canvas around her face, leaving only her eyes exposed. She grabbed his arm, squeezing it once, hard. Elias unbolted the front door. He had to throw his entire body weight against the wood to push it open against the packed snow and the howling wind. The moment the door opened, the storm attacked them. It was a physical assault. The wind screamed in their ears, deafening and disorienting. The snow was a blinding wall of white, stinging their exposed skin like thousands of tiny needles. Elias stepped out into the drift, the snow immediately swallowing him up to his thighs. He fought his way forward, driving his legs like pistons against the resistance. Maya followed right behind him, stepping into the deep tracks he was creating. The cold was instantaneous and absolute, cutting through their meager layers of clothing within seconds. They moved painfully slow. Elias kept his head down, counting his steps, trying to maintain a straight line. The wind pushed against him from the side, trying to knock him off course. He could feel the tension on the rope connecting him to Maya. It was a lifeline, a physical reminder that he was not alone in the void. 10 steps. 20 steps. The barn should be right in front of them, but Elias couldn't see anything but swirling white. Panic began to claw at the edges of his mind. If they missed the barn, they would wander into the open field and freeze to death in minutes. 30 steps. Nothing. Elias stopped. He turned around, pulling on the rope. Maya bumped into him, nearly knocking them both over. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with terror above the canvas mask. "We missed it!" Elias yelled, though he could barely hear his own voice over the wind. Maya shook her head violently. She pointed a mittened hand slightly to their left. Elias squinted against the driving snow. For a fraction of a second, the wind shifted, thinning the whiteout, and he saw it, a dark, looming shadow just 10 feet away. The wind had pushed them off course. Elias grabbed Maya's hand, gripping it tightly, and lurched toward the shadow. They slammed into the wooden side of the barn.
Elias felt his way along the rough wood until he found the edge of the door. It was frozen shut, packed with snow. He let go of Maya's hand and began frantically digging at the snow with his gloved hands, clearing the base of the door. Maya fell to her knees beside him, digging with equal desperation. Their hands were completely numb, clumsy blocks of ice, but they didn't stop.
When the base was clear, Elias stood up, put his shoulder against the wood, and shoved with every ounce of strength he had left. The door groaned, the frozen hinges cracking loudly, and it gave way just enough for them to squeeze through. They tumbled into the dark interior of the barn, falling onto the hard, frozen dirt floor. Elias kicked the door shut behind them, cutting off the shriek of the wind. The silence inside the barn was deafening. They lay on the floor for several minutes, gasping for air, their lungs burning from the cold. Elias couldn't feel his hands or feet. He slowly rolled over and sat up. Maya was beside him, curled into a ball, shivering uncontrollably. Elias forced himself to stand. His legs felt like lead pillars. He stumbled to the back corner where he had stacked the emergency wood. He grabbed as many logs as he could carry, his arms trembling under the weight. "Maya," he gasped. "Get up. We have to go back." Maya didn't move. Her shivering was slowing down, a dangerous sign. The cold was seeping into her core, shutting her body down. Elias dropped the wood. He knelt beside her and hauled her into a sitting position. Her eyes were half closed, glassy and unfocused. "Maya!" Elias shouted, slapping her cheek lightly. "Look at me! You have to stand up!" She mumbled something incomprehensible, her head lolling against his shoulder. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Elias's chest. He couldn't lose her. He had lost too much already. He refused to let the cold take her. He stood up, dragging her with him. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her upright. He slapped her cheeks again, harder this time. "Maya, damn it, wake up!" he roared. "You didn't survive a war to die in a barn. Open your eyes!" Maya groaned, her eyelids fluttering. She looked at him, confusion clouding her gaze. "Wood," Elias commanded, pointing to the pile he had dropped. "Pick up the wood. We are going back, now!" He forced her to bend down, placing a small log into her arms. She clutched it weakly against her chest. Elias gathered the rest of the wood, piling it into his own arms, securing the bundle with his chin. He checked the rope connecting them. It was secure. "Follow me," he said, turning toward the door. The journey back was a nightmare. The wind had increased in ferocity, a solid wall of force trying to push them back into the barn. Elias led the way, using his body as a shield to break the wind for Maya. Every step was an agony of exertion. His legs cramped, his lungs screamed, and the cold gnawed at his bones. He could feel the rope pulling tight behind him, dragging heavily. Maya was struggling, stumbling in his wake. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. If they stopped, they died. He focused entirely on the next step. Just one more step. Lift the leg, push through the snow, plant the foot, repeat. It felt like they walked for hours, though it was only a distance of 50 yards. Suddenly, Elias crashed into something solid. He fell forward, dropping the wood into the snow, and banged his forehead against rough wood. It was the front door of the house. He fell to his knees, frantically searching the snow for the wood he had dropped. He gathered the logs, clutching them to his chest. He reached back and pulled hard on the rope. Maya stumbled forward, falling onto her knees beside him in the snow. She dropped her log, collapsing completely. Elias unbolted the door and shoved it open. He grabbed Maya by the collar of her coat and physically dragged her over the threshold, pulling her into the main room. He went back, kicked the dropped log inside, and slammed the door shut, throwing the heavy iron bolt into place. They were inside. They were alive. Elias didn't waste a second. He dropped the wood by the stove. The embers were almost dead, barely glowing in the ash. He grabbed a handful of dry kindling he kept near the stove and shoved it into the firebox. He fell to his knees and blew on the embers gently, desperately coaxing them back to life.
He blew until spots danced in his vision, until his lungs ached. A tiny tongue of orange flame flickered. It caught the edge of a dry pine needle, then spread to a small twig. Elias carefully fed it more kindling, building a fragile pyramid of fire. When it was burning steadily, he added 2 small logs. Only then did he turn to Maya. She was lying on the floor exactly where he had dragged her, unmoving. Elias stripped off his heavy, snow-covered coat. He rushed over to her and began frantically pulling off her frozen coat, her wet mittens, her boots. Her skin was ice-cold, pale and waxy. Her lips were blue. He dragged her across the floor, pulling her close to the stove. The heat was just beginning to radiate outward. He grabbed every blanket in the house, throwing them over her. He sat beside her, rubbing her arms and legs vigorously, trying to force the blood to circulate. "Maya," he kept saying, his voice rough with panic. "Maya, come back! Wake up!" For a terrifying 10 minutes, she didn't respond. Elias kept rubbing her limbs, his own hands thawing painfully in the heat of the stove. He was terrified. He realized in that moment, with a sudden, startling clarity, that he wasn't just trying to save a human life. He was trying to save her. The thought of this house without her, of returning to the suffocating silence and the deep, black void of his grief, was unbearable. She had become his tether to the living world. Finally, Maya let out a long, shuddering gasp. Her eyelids fluttered and she opened her eyes. She looked at Elias, her gaze slowly coming into focus. She felt the heavy pile of blankets on top of her, felt the heat of the stove against her side, and saw Elias kneeling over her, his face pale and drawn tight with worry. "Elias," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. Elias stopped rubbing her arms. He slumped back against the floor, a massive, shuddering breath tearing from his lungs. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking with the sheer adrenaline release. "You're alive," he muttered into his hands. "You stubborn, foolish woman, you're alive." Maya managed a weak, exhausted smile. She reached out from under the blankets, her cold fingers finding his wrist. She held on to him weakly. "We got the wood," she whispered. Elias dropped his hands and looked at her. He let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh. He looked at the small pile of wood by the stove, the wood they had nearly died for. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We got the wood." He didn't move away. He sat on the floor beside her, holding her hand while the fire roared back to life in the stove, pushing the bitter cold back into the corners of the room. They stayed like that for hours, wrapped in blankets, listening to the storm rage outside, safe in the small, warm sanctuary they had fought so hard to defend. The storm finally broke 3 days later. The wind died down and the sun emerged, a brilliant, blinding sphere in a crisp blue sky. The world outside was a pristine, rolling ocean of white, beautiful and deadly. Inside the house, something fundamental had shifted. The barrier of polite distance between them, the unspoken rule of keeping to their own spaces, was gone. They had faced death together and survived. The trauma of the blizzard had stripped away the last layers of their defenses, leaving them bare and honest with each other. Elias stopped sleeping on the floor near the stove. He moved his canvas tarp and blanket into the parlor, setting up his sleeping area on the opposite side of the room from Maya's bed. It was a practical move. The stove heated the parlor well enough now that the front door was properly sealed, but it was also an intimate one. They were sharing a space, a real room, not just camping in a ruin. As winter slowly began to loosen its grip, yielding to the subtle, gradual thaw of early spring, the house transformed in earnest. It was no longer just about survival. It was about comfort. It was about making a home. Maya's influence was everywhere. She had found a stash of old, rusted tin cans in the cellar. She spent days scrubbing them clean, removing the rust with sand and then hammering the sharp edges smooth. She used them to organize their meager supplies, flour, salt, dried beans, lining them up neatly on the shelf Elias had built. She found a bundle of dried lavender hanging from the rafters in the barn, surprisingly intact, and crushed the flowers, tying them into small cloth pouches that she placed in the corners of the rooms, replacing the smell of dust and damp with a faint, clean floral scent. Elias, too, was working with a new energy. The deep, crushing weight of his grief hadn't disappeared. It would never fully disappear, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a heavy stone on his chest preventing him from breathing. It was a quiet ache in the background, a scar that throbbed occasionally but didn't stop him from moving. He began to repair the house, not just to stop the wind, but to make it solid. He replaced the rotting floorboards in the kitchen with fresh wood he had painstakingly planed by hand. He built a proper frame for the window, replacing the canvas with a pane of salvaged glass he found in the ruins of the neighboring cabin. When he installed it, setting it with homemade putty and a prayer, light poured into the room, illuminating the scrubbed floors, the neat shelves, and Maya sitting at the table, bathed in gold. One afternoon in late March, the snow was melting rapidly, creating small rushing streams that chattered down the hillside. The air smelled of wet earth and thawing pine. Elias was outside repairing the front porch, replacing the collapsed beams with thick, sturdy logs he had felled and stripped. Maya came out carrying 2 tin cups of hot, sweet pine needle tea. She walked carefully across the uneven ground, handing a cup to Elias. He set his hammer down, took the cup, and leaned against the newly installed railing. Maya stood beside him, holding her cup with both hands, letting the steam warm her face. They stood in comfortable silence, looking out over the valley. The harsh, jagged lines of winter were softening, revealing the brown and green promises of spring beneath the receding snow.
"The snow is almost gone," Maya said softly, looking at the distant mountains. "It is," Elias agreed, taking a sip of his tea. "The ground will be soft enough to dig soon." He didn't look at her, but he felt her gaze shift to him. "To dig?" she asked. Elias pointed toward the patch of overgrown weeds near the south-facing wall of the house. It got the most sun during the day. "I was thinking," Elias said, his voice slow and deliberate, "that would be a good spot for a garden. We need to turn the soil, pull the rocks. We can use the ash from the stove for fertilizer. I saved some seeds from my coat pockets. Carrots, some tough greens. It won't be much this year, but it's a start." He looked at Maya. She was staring at the patch of ground, her eyes wide, her expression unreadable. "A garden," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Elias said gently. He remembered the story he had told her months ago about his wife, about planting seeds. A house is not a home until something grows outside its door. He was offering her more than just a plot of dirt. He was offering a future. He was asking her to stay. Not just for the winter, not just until it was safe to travel. He was asking her to help him grow something in this ruined place. Maya slowly turned to look at him. Her dark eyes were swimming with tears, but they weren't tears of grief or terror. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. She looked at the sturdy new porch railing, at the glass in the window, at the neatly stacked woodpile. She looked at Elias, the gruff, broken man who had taken her in, protected her, and treated her with a quiet, unwavering dignity. She reached out and placed her hand over his, resting on the wooden railing. Her hand was calloused now, strong and capable, a perfect match for his own. "I know how to tend a garden," Maya said, her voice thick but steady, a brilliant, beautiful smile breaking across her face. "My mother taught me." "We will plant it together." Elias looked down at their joined hands, feeling the warmth of her skin against his knuckles. He looked back up at her, seeing the sunlight catching the gold in her dark eyes. The ruined house behind them was quiet,
solid and safe. The wind blowing down from the mountains was no longer a threat. It was just a breeze, carrying the scent of thawing earth and new beginnings. "Yes," Elias said, a deep, genuine smile reaching his eyes for the first time in a year, erasing the harsh lines of his face. "We will plant it together." They stood there on the porch they had rebuilt, drinking their tea, watching the snow melt. Two broken people who had found each other in the ruins and, piece by piece, board by board, had slowly, stubbornly built a home. The war was a distant echo, the past a quiet shadow. They only had the spring ahead of them, the soil waiting to be turned, and the quiet, enduring warmth of the life they had chosen to cultivate together in the forgotten valley.